Okay guys, so we're going to look at macrocycles, mesocycles and microcycles. Now these are essentially just forms of terminology that we use in program design in order to describe certain phases and the lengths of phases, or at least imply the lengths of phases. So the three terms, we've got macrocycle, mesocycle and microcycle. Macrocycle, up at the top, essentially describes the point we're starting at, and we're going to take that individual all the way to their goal, their entire body of training and body of work, regardless of how it's split up along the way, that entire journey, that's their macrocycle. So essentially, we're going from point A to point B. So you might decide that an individual's macrocycle is the beginning of their contest prep, all the way up until the end of their contest prep, of course. And along the way, we're going to prescribe certain blocks of training that essentially break it down along the way. They might do 3 blocks of training. So their macrocycle might be start of prep, point A, point B being end of prep, and along the way we're going to do 3 blocks of training. Now, the name for the blocks of training is essentially mesocycle. Mesocycle is the technical term for blocks of training. In fact, technically, block of training refers to a macrocycle, although it's more popularly coined in terms of describing mesocycles these days. But essentially, mesocycles are block 1, block 2, and block 3, as I've written there. So you've got the macrocycle, overarching, A to B, what the goal is, however it's split up. Mesocycles are the individual sort of blocks, I guess, the chunks, the individual chunks. Now we can also further break down the mesocycles into microcycles. Now, microcycles typically are mostly found, most commonly, in weeks. So your mesocycle might be 6 weeks long, and each microcycle might be a week long. So say, for example, you're going to get an individual to train push-pull legs in a week. Then that means that week of training and all the different workouts it contains would be their microcycle. And you would decide how many microcycles long their average block of training should be, as I've described down here. So when you hear these terms getting thrown around, that's essentially what they describe. Now, there is a lot of conversation about whether this is essentially completely necessary when it comes to hypertrophy or bodybuilding training in order to split your training up like this. And I think it really just comes down to the preference of the coach and also potentially the preference of the individual, but usually the coaching methods would be the main reason. But essentially, there are justifications for having just one ongoing training setup that you might just change things in and out along the way. And there's a lot of argument for splitting up your training into mesocycles like this. Now, me personally, I prefer splitting up training into mesocycles like this, where essentially I will design a small program or a small mesocycle with a certain training split, with certain exercise selection and all the rest of it. And I would have an individual work through that and progress as much as they possibly can for a shorter period of time. And after that individual has essentially exhausted their potential for progressing in that short period of time, then I like to have someone pull back, rest if needed, put a new block of training in place where essentially we're applying a fresh stimulus to the body, because novel stimulus can be quite powerful for really driving things forwards. And you should, in theory, see an accelerated rate of progress from that point. You'll then try and sustain the accelerated rate of progress for however many weeks I've decided their next mesocycle would be, until they ultimately exhaust their potential for progression with that mesocycle, and then you pull back and you put a new one in place after that. So it's this rinse and repeat cycle of getting someone to do things in short bursts with an accelerated rate of progress, and after it slows down to the point where I believe they would just be better off changing it up and regaining an accelerated rate of progress, in my experience that's always yielded the best results. Now on the other hand, you don't necessarily need to do that. It is a lot of work for the coach, and some coaches genuinely are a bit too busy in order to do that, and if that's their coaching style, that's fine. On the other hand, what we could do is potentially have one mesocycle that is essentially the entire length of the macrocycle, and along the way, instead of splitting things up into phases where we're making drastic changes between them, you could also have one long block of training, so to speak, where you have an individual run it, and if exercises sporadically here and there plateau or need changed for whatever reason, pains, niggles, plateaus, whatever it is, performance drops off, you could just swap exercises in and out, but essentially keep the chassis of the same block exactly the same. So those are a couple of different options. There's arguments for both. That second option, as I said, it's not my preferred way of doing things, but it is very simple. And for people who really like consistency and don't like too much change, that can be great as well. And I actually think that I would make more of an argument for that style of training for people who are more beginners. So say, for example, a beginner, you program a mesocycle that is 8 weeks long, and you have them do a certain setup with certain exercises in a certain sequence with certain volume selection. Then if that individual is a beginner and their technique is not the best and they don't understand how to train with a close proximity to failure, then what you can find is after the third or fourth or sometimes even fifth week, if they're really unskilled and really are a beginner, it might take them that many weeks to build up the technique, potentially the confidence, the awareness of where the failure point is with those exercises specifically, because every exercise genuinely feels different. So if they've taken 5 weeks into an 8-week mesocycle because you've programmed an 8-week mesocycle for them, if they've taken more than half of the time in order to develop proper training habits, and then 3 weeks later, after only 3 weeks of high quality training, you're changing the block and essentially pulling the rug from under their feet, that can be counterproductive as well. So I think also a big point to make here is it really depends on the kind of coach. It really depends on the coaching style, but then it even more should depend on the type of client and their experience level, their skill and their training intensity as well. And actually as a coach, you should probably have the ability to do many different styles of programming and recognize what stage an individual is at, their experience level, skill level, intensity, and then awareness of intensity, and all of these different factors that a good experienced coach can take into consideration and decide the right tools to deploy for that individual to get the best out of them. So essentially, without ranting on too much, we have got macrocycle, mesocycles, and microcycles. These are all terms. You don't need to do it in one set specific way. This is very generalistic and completely, it is down to the coaching style and preference. But at the end of the day, it's good to have an awareness of the different tools. And if this video was helpful, then I'm glad it helped. If you have any further questions, all you need to do is drop me a message and I will chat to you in the next one.